Okay, I'm recording now.
Okay.
Right. So what I'm going to ask you is, I'm going to ask you just general things about the excavation. I'm going to ask you about your experience in archaeology and things like that. So there's really not a ton of pressure.
Okay.
I mean, it's just a conversation, nothing like super academic or anything like that, you know.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. So the first thing I wanted to talk to you about is, do you have any archaeological experience, and can you tell me a little bit about it?
Yeah, so I, in the summer of 2022, worked at Monticello where I did my field school, and that's Thomas Jefferson's presidential plantation. So it was mostly looking at the households of enslaved laborers on the plantation, and that was like a really good opportunity for me to kind of familiarize myself with like archaeological methods while also kind of like getting that experience working with the African diaspora. And then this past summer, so summer of 2023, I was at Estate Little Princess in St. Croix, which was a former Dutch sugar plantation. And that was another really good experience in terms of working with the African diaspora. I think it gave me a lot of like good background in terms of like being able to work with more soil types because soil varies from site to site. And it also gave me a sense of a different kind of assemblage because at least with at Monticello, like ceramics, for example, like we did get like a pretty good range of ceramics, but I think in St. Croix, because it is located like at a trading port, or it's a bit more of like a trading kind of island, you can see that reflected in like the ceramics where you're getting stuff truly just from everywhere and all over the place. And then also the occupation period in St. Croix was a lot longer, where people were occupying Estate Little Princess, I want to say like, I forget the exact start date, but maybe like around like late 1600s, all the way up until the 1960s, when the American government at that point forced people to stop living like on Estate Little Princess and to instead move into like public housing. So
So a couple of things. So the road is really noisy.
Yes.
But the microphone, I mean, I'll look at it usually picks up really well.
okay.
Like your voice tends to be really good.
Okay.
I've tried this before with Ethan, and it worked fine.
Okay.
I'm just double check.
Okay. Yeah, it's like rush hour or something right now.
Oh yeah, I can hear really clearly.
Okay.
So my next question would be, so how does it compare to Kenyan?
Well, for one, the soil is definitely a bit different. It's still a bit clayey, and that was very much so what the soil texture was at Monticello. But the most obvious one to me is really the community that we're looking at in this case, and also sort of the way in which we remember the landscape that we're present on. So obviously, where we're digging is Kenyon College and continues to be like an active college landscape. And so I think that, and is also a college that I'm obviously a part of. And I think it's certainly like very interesting to see how Kenyon as a higher education institution has continued to kind of build around a lot of like these landscapes and around like a lot of these places. And I think it also is like one of the first places to kind of be settled in, I want to say, like in Ohio by European settlers. And so I think that also adds like a very, I think the same is true for a lot of the other places that I've been at before, but it's certainly interesting to see, I guess, how that process of sort of making Gambier into a home or into a location of Kenyon College, how that's happened. And I think it's also been really nice to have this as a part of, you know, the regular academic session, where it can just be nice to like take a break from, you know, writing papers and sitting in class listening to lecture, and then just get out there and dig with my classmates.
So, riffing out of that, what do you think about, can you tell me a little bit about your experience excavating and just like being in the dirt with your classmates and being in a test pit for hours, just focusing on what you're doing with other people?
Yeah, I think it's definitely been a very nice experience. I've really enjoyed digging with all of my dig partners, just because I think, there is a certain amount of attention and focus that's necessary to do archaeological work, especially in the unit that I've been working on. So we've been on kind of a corner unit where we're trying to get down to the foundation, like the foundation of, I believe, the dining hall, or that's at least what it's been labeled as on maps. And it's a bit of a tricky unit because we get both the inside of like this structure and also the wall part of the structure, and so there's a lot of attention that needs to be paid to those shifts in soil because they tell us a bit about like the context and a bit about the processes that happen in the unit. So we still have to kind of like pay attention to all of these things and then also be careful, especially when we have the pickaxe, that we're not like tearing anything up or breaking anything. But outside of that, it really is a lot of time to just kind of sit and talk with people and kind of get a sense about how they feel about like the archaeology that they're doing, and like a lot of time for us to kind of reflect on how what we're finding aligns with narratives about Kenyon's like founding that we're taught about, even before we get to campus, when Kenyon will send, I know Kenyon sent me like letters and little pamphlets kind of talking about the origin and the founding of Kenyon's history. And sometimes when you're digging, things will come up that might push back against like those narratives that are so well established surrounding the college, and really make you question and reconsider like who was here on this landscape, and how were they existing in this space.
So a couple of things. One is, first let's tackle this. So how then do you feel about excavating the literal foundation of the college, like the literal foundation of the first building where everything started? Especially, there's two reasons of this questions. There's two sides. One is that you are talking about how you have to be really careful in the archaeology, right? Because it's very discreet, every little thing can be a big change. So that's one thing. And then the second thing, I want to hear your thoughts about this idea of placemaking and stories, which it seems that you find really interesting and important for the college.
Yeah, I mean, I think something that Kenyon College has on pretty much all of its syllabuses, a lot of the official paperwork that they'll release, is a land acknowledgement statement, kind of about that's supposed to be dedicated to the Native American tribes that were present on this landscape before Kenyon's founding. And I think that that's always something that I've had a lot of questions about, and sort of a lot of wondering about, well, how do you go from having these Native American groups in this area to then all of a sudden there being this brand new, like, was Kenyon Episcopalian at its founding? Yeah, so like to having this brand new Episcopalian college that's like seeking to educate the people who are ideally going to go into like the upper echelons of like society after like finishing their education here. And I think it's been like, in particular, I've really enjoyed the time spent in the archive, because I think that's another aspect of like this class that's been really, really good for me, where I've had experience like looking through archives before, but I think from the jump we've been shown like a lot of like the archival data that accompanies like the site that we're working at, and so that's been like a really interesting way of like getting me to even reconsider who was really here at the on the landscape like at the time of the founding. Because I know in the post office there's this mural that has like a picture of Philander Chase and a person whose name I forget, but it was Curtis, yeah, Henry Curtis, looking over the landscape and then saying the like supposed line of like, this will do, or something along those lines. And I think that that's like a very central narrative of like this implication that there was nobody here, that it was the arrival of like these Kenyan people who made this place into a place. But even in the archival research, like we read a chapter from one of the college's historians talking about how actually at the bottom of the hill at Kenyon there were the squatters who were around, and that was like the exact terminology that was used in the archive. And there's a lot going on there with language, but there supposedly was like a rum distillery, like there were multiple houses, multiple families, like communities, and those people actually helped build like some of these first buildings on campus. And so I think even having that knowledge accompanying like us going down on the wall and starting to see the appearance of mortar, seeing the prevalence of nails, which has been something that has like popped up more and more as we've gotten deeper and deeper into the unit. I think it colors a new kind of understanding of how Kenyon has attempted to build its place in this landscape and how it really isn't as insular of a notion as the college would like us to believe in a lot of their like remembrances of Kenyon College and how it came to be. And so I think that's like one thing that's been like very interesting to like experience and to think about as we do this archaeological work. And then I think in terms of like placemaking, it definitely, we learn a lot from the assemblages that we generate from this digging in terms of we see the materials that people would use to kind of build a home or build at least a place where they would be remaining for like an extended amount of time. And you sort of see people taking the landscape and that supposedly, according to, you know, Philander Chase and Henry Curtis and all of these like college historians, was like this empty and vacant landscape. You see them refashioning that like quote unquote vacant landscape into a place that can then serve their needs. And I think that that's like, that tells a lot kind of about not only the work required to establish a college like this, but also sort of the expectations of existing in a space like this, where I know like we haven't found a ton, in our unit at least, we haven't found a bunch of colored glass or a ton of shaped glass, which I usually would like associate with like wine bottles. I know like there's a wine green, like that's pretty common for wine bottles of the period, and we haven't found a ton of that. And I think that sort of contributes to my understanding of sort of what the culture was like on campus, where I know in the documentary records they say like students were not allowed to drink, like that was like very much so prohibited. And so it's interesting to see how effective that kind of policing of the landscape was and to see how that manifests in the spaces that we're working in.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, people are putting their own meaning to the landscape, you know, and it's a very secular, very religious started meaning, very strict, almost military-like. No drinking. We know where the distillery is, by the way. I know where it is. I found it. It's, you know who, Pashmina Professor?
Oh, yeah.
So in their house, behind it, there's a river. That's where it is.
Oh, wow.
I mean, I don't know exactly where it is, but I'm going to see if I can adjust the light a little bit. But we talked to Tom Stamp and other people. He's a historian, and that's definitely like that's where we think it was. It was definitely where we think it was set. So going on that, what do you think about then of being excavating in the middle of campus on Parents' Weekend, and people just asking questions and all these kind of things. Can you tell me a little bit about your experience there?
Yeah, I mean, I think the work that we're doing in this landscape is definitely work that needs to be shared, in the sense that I think, like I was kind of saying before, like this is work that works both with and against the archive that we already have of Kenyon's history. And so I think, you know, people who are choosing to send their kids here, you know, they also are part of like these cycles and these kinds of like narratives of how like, you know, how Kenyon came to be. And I think also more generally, I think campus archaeology and the work that we're doing here has the potential to kind of like not just like exist solely at Kenyon, but also extend to other higher education institutions, where I know in class we've read about archaeology done on other campuses, and sort of like thinking through how, you know, the creation and the generation of these colleges was not nearly as seamless as I think a lot of these narratives would like, or college narratives would like for people to think that they are. And so I think it's very, I think at times I can get a bit shy and I'm like, I don't know that I want to like talk to people a bunch right now, but at the same time, it is knowledge that I think has the potential to really help us all kind of like think through, you know, how we establish ourselves like on the American landscape, especially because where Kenyon is where it was first like established was sort of on like the frontier of like the newer part of America. And so I think there are a lot of implications that come with that. And I think that something as well that like archaeology has like a lot of potential to highlight is sort of the labor and work required to have these places exist and sort of who was present on these landscapes. And so I know one thing we found that was like super interesting in our unit was like a porcelain doll arm. And like you can't make too many assumptions about where things came from, but it certainly wasn't something that I would have expected anyone on that landscape to be using or to want in their space, really. And so just little things like that kind of make you, you know, reconsider and have a bit of a departure from like what is remembered in the archive, because that's also a very important factor of the archive, where I think you can see traces of all sorts of people in the archive, but there are only certain people who are remembered or sort of highlighted, I guess is like the right word, within the archive. And so with like that kind of archaeology and like with, you know, parents being interested in it, just like members of the general public too, people just walking through, because it is like a very central part of campus, like I think it really, at least for me, it's like informed kind of how I feel existing on like this Kenyon landscape and how I kind of see my relationship to the space. Yeah.
Excellent. Two more questions in that, that's it. So the first one, and this is the this is kind of like not a tricky one. That's not what this is, but it's something that I was thinking about while people were excavating. There's this whole thing about, so archaeology is about identity, right? You're excavating, and there's also this colonial aspect of archaeology, in which, well, archaeology is usually done by people from other countries, and then they go, or communities that have access to remains, right? And that implies power, implies ethnicity, implies all these things. And there's this, as you know, there's this movement about decolonizing archaeology and anthropology, and people are still trying to figure out how would that look. So, would you say that what you guys are doing is native archaeology, in a sense that you guys, if Kenyon College is a community and you guys belong to Kenyon College and you're excavating your own community, would it be a stretch saying that's native archaeology, in the sense that you are, I mean, it's not like you're excavating your own past, but you're excavating the past of an institution that you belong to and has molded and shaped you in a way or another. I don't know. I thought that was an interesting question, but I don't know what your thoughts about it are.
I mean, I think it's a bit, like you said, a bit of a tricky question.
It is.
In the sense that I feel like there's a certain degree of power that comes with like saying that you are native to an area, and almost like I worry a bit of like a naturalization like of your presence onto that landscape, and like a claim that comes like with that, where one of the things that I consistently think about with archaeology, especially with the projects that I've done in the past, is that when you do that archaeology and when you excavate materials and catalog them and, you know, keep them out of the ground and kind of keep them in your own possession, there is a power there that exists in being able to have those collections in the first place. And so I think that archaeology is this thing that sort of, in the generation of assemblages, in the generation of an archaeological archive, you get these claims of ownership that end up happening like over, you know, things that are being excavated. And so I think it's like, while I definitely do feel like, at least in some ways, connected to like the archaeological work that we're doing here, I think that the landscape itself, like, I don't know, I've been paying attention like as we've been digging to like see whether or not like modified lithics or something that like come up, or things that could be like associated with like Native American groups, like whether those come up, just because I know at Monticello, for example, like to do archaeology in those spaces, like on that plantation, meant that it was also mixed in with like occupation periods of like Native American groups. And so I think that the idea of a landscape is like is a very tricky one. And so I wouldn't necessarily say that we are native like to the area, almost because I think that would sort of solidify even further like Kenyon's presence on like this landscape, where I think one of the biggest questions that I always have, and one of the things that I think I'm gonna hopefully be considering in my final paper, like chapter thing that I'm going to be writing for this class, is sort of how does land in America go from, you know, being unclaimed, not being a part of like property, not being owned, to then being owned by like people, organizations, and then being developed and manipulated and used to serve the needs of like the people who own that land. And so I think that's still like a very tricky question, especially with the land acknowledgement that Kenyon, I think at this point like requires to be put on every syllabus, and also yeah, or at least like is present on like all of the syllabuses.
That's true. Yeah.
I think like it's definitely very interesting, at least for me, to kind of consider like how, at what point did this land become Kenyan land, and is that process of this becoming Kenyan land complete? Because I think in certain ways, I think there are still ways in which like this landscape has not been fully taken or fully, like I think there's still ways to, I think, maybe free the land, or I don't know that I want to say like free the land, but there's still, I think, a lot of uncertainty in claims to like this land, and I think that's sort of a problem that America as like an institution, certainly like, or as a government, like has to think through and has to kind of grapple with.
Excellent. Last thing, did you do you think that was the excavation what you expected, or was it like, you know, did it meet your expectations, I suppose, as a person that has already been in archaeological digs? Because, well, one of the things also for this class is that I don't know how it was in Monticello and the others, but here you would not be a technician. You would be someone that actually gets to say something, create knowledge about this. So just in general, I mean, what do you feel about this whole process? Did it meet your expectations or did it not?
I think it sort of exceeded my expectations of what we were going to be finding, in part because I had this assumption that Kenyon would try to keep and like, or sort of would almost do like a more, or like a more complete, or like almost a better job, like kind of like taking down some of these structures and like removing their traces of them per se. But I think going into it and then spending more time in the archive, it became clear that I think Kenyon kind of has like a bit of a history of just sort of like going through buildings and like kind of doing the minimum in certain ways of like kind of like removing the trace of that building from the landscape. And so I think I was a bit surprised by like just how much we were finding. And I think also something that I think I could have like expected, and I certainly did expect, was to find things that could have been more expensive. But in our unit we actually found an engraved pipe bowl, or was it the pipe bowl? It was either I think both like an engraved tobacco pipe stem and then a piece of like a bowl as well that was engraved. And I've like seen engraved like pipe pieces before, but I had never seen one that intricate. And so I think stuff like that sort of makes me really think about like who was here, like what did it take to be here in this landscape? Like, was it like, I think that's like an interesting thing to consider, especially when there are some stories like in the archives talking about how
We can stop it for a while.
Yeah.
It's going really slowly.
yeah it's okay. But especially when they're,
Oh my god.
oh yeah, it was just a new level. But when there's stories in the archive talking about how sometimes during the winter, students would stick their feet like outside because the dorms were too wet and cold. And so they would just stick their feet outside so that they could sit in the sun and kind of like heat up. And so I think like these are interesting things to kind of consider alongside something that could have potentially been more expensive. And I think it's definitely, I think that's one thing that's been like a bit shocking to me. And I think also just how much we were able to get done and how deep we were able to get, even though we were only digging like once a week for for I don't know how long, for a good few weeks, maybe 10 weeks, maybe?
Something like that.
Something like that. So
Yeah. I mean, to think about, I mean, if we were in a actual just doing this, we would have been there for 6 weeks, maybe 8 hours a day.
Yeah.
So I think it was great that everybody had their own unit and created their own story. I think it was really good. And yeah, that's it.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem.